Walking through Chicago, you might notice something unsettling. Windows sitting right at sidewalk level, doors that seem to lead nowhere. Stone buildings that look like they are sinking into the earth. Online, these images are often presented as evidence of something called a mud flood, a mysterious global disaster that supposedly buried entire cities and erased history. But the truth is stranger, because Chicago was not buried by a catastrophe. It was buried on purpose. In the mid-1800s, Chicago did not rise into the modern world. It was lifted there, mechanically, deliberately, and in full view of the public. To understand why, you have to imagine Chicago as it once was. This city was not built on solid ground. It was built on a swamp. Beneath the streets was soft, waterlogged mud, no natural drainage, no elevation, no real foundation. Waste had nowhere to go. Sewage pooled in the streets. Dead animals rotted where they fell. Horses regularly sank up to their bellies in the muck. Cholera outbreaks swept through the population, killing thousands. Chicago was growing fast, but it was becoming unlivable. City leaders faced an impossible problem. They needed sewers, but digging down was not an option. The water table was too high. So instead of lowering the ground, they made a radical decision. They would raise the entire city, not just the streets, not just new buildings, everything, brick by brick, block by block. And somehow, they would do it without stopping daily life. What followed would become one of the most daring and least believed engineering feats in American history. The solution did not begin with machinery. It began with mathematics. Chicago's engineers calculated that even a perfectly designed sewer system would fail unless it could slope downward. But the city was so flat that waste would simply sit inside the pipes instead of flowing. There was only one way to create slope: raise the streets. By increasing street elevation, engineers could install sewer pipes above the original ground level and angle them downward toward the river. Gravity would finally work in their favor, but only if the entire surface of the city moved with it. That created a second problem. Chicago was already built. Thousands of brick buildings rested directly on the old street level. If the streets were raised without the buildings, every entrance would be buried. Entire neighborhoods would become unusable overnight. So engineers expanded the plan. Buildings would have to rise too, not rebuilt, not replaced, lifted intact. This was not theoretical. Chicago engineers had already tested the idea on small structures, using mechanical jack screws, simple iron devices that could lift enormous weight when turned slowly and evenly. The math works. If enough jacks were placed beneath a structure, and if they were turned at exactly the same rate, a building could rise without twisting or cracking. The challenge was not strength. It was coordination. To raise an entire city, thousands of jacks would have to move in perfect unison across blocks of occupied buildings, while daily life continued inside. No city had ever tried this before, but in Chicago, the calculations were clear. Either the city rose together, or it drowned where it stood. For the people living in Chicago, the raising of the city was not a headline or a single event. It was something they adjusted to, quietly, in their daily routines. A mother would wake up and notice the front step had changed overnight. The door was higher now. The street felt farther away. She learned to lift her children a little higher when they went outside, to steady them on temporary stairs that had not been there the week before. Shopkeepers opened their doors as usual, even as workers beneath the floors turned iron screws below them. Counters stayed level. Shelves did not rattle. Business continued. Some people ate meals while the building they sat in was slowly rising. inch by inch, without vibration or noise loud enough to notice. Outside, the city became uneven and improvised. Boardwalks connected streets that no longer lined up. Wooden steps were rebuilt, removed, and rebuilt again. Wagon drivers memorized new routes. Pedestrians learned where the ground had shifted since yesterday. For laborers turning the jacks, the work was repetitive and precise. They did not rush. They listened for signals. They watched the building above them, making sure it stayed level. At night, families slept in rooms that were slowly changing their place in the city, even if it did not feel that way. The transformation was not dramatic. It was constant, and for the people living through it, the impossible did not announce itself. It became normal, until one day they realized the city around them no longer sat where it once had, and that change would quietly shape their lives for generations to come. Once Chicago proved the city could be raised safely, the project entered a new phase. What began as a solution for sanitation became an experiment in scale. Engineers stopped thinking in terms of individual buildings and began planning entire blocks. Structures were measured, weighed, and mapped. Calculations determined exactly how many jacks each building required and where they had to be placed to keep everything level. In some cases, hundreds of feet of buildings were lifted at the same time, moving together as a single unit. The most extraordinary example was the Tremont House Hotel. Covering more than an acre and rising 6 stories tall, it was one of the largest buildings in the city. Shutting it down would have meant weeks of disruption. Instead, the city chose to lift it intact. More than 5,000 jacks were installed beneath the structure. One engineer oversaw the entire operation. At a coordinated signal, teams began turning the screws together. The hotel rose slowly, evenly, and without visible strain. Not a single wall cracked, not a single window broke. By the time the work was complete, the building stood several feet higher than before, ready to meet the new street level. Projects like this were repeated across the city. Chicago was not just raising buildings. It was proving that an entire city could be moved deliberately, precisely, and at a scale no one had ever attempted before. What had once been unthinkable was now engineered into routine practice, and the success of each project made the next one larger, bolder, and more ambitious than the last. When the work was finished, Chicago did not erase its past. It buried it. The original street level did not disappear. It became something else. Former ground floors turned into basements. Doorways became walls. Windows that once looked out onto busy streets now opened into darkness. In some places, entire rooms were sealed off and forgotten. In others, they were repurposed, used as storage, workshops, or shelter for those who lived on the margins of the growing city. Beneath the sidewalks, a second Chicago remained, layered below the modern one, quiet and unseen. The raised streets solved the city's sanitation crisis and made large-scale sewers possible. Disease rates fell, flooding decreased. The city became safer and more livable. But the decision also reshaped Chicago's relationship with its own history. Instead of demolishing and starting over, the city adapted vertically. It built forward while leaving what came before intact, just out of sight. Today, those buried spaces still exist. They appear unexpectedly, behind a bricked-over doorway, beneath a staircase, or through a window half hidden by the sidewalk. They are not evidence of a lost civilization or a forgotten catastrophe. They are proof of a deliberate choice, a city that refused to abandon what it had built, even when the ground beneath it failed. Chicago did not just rise. It learned how to live on top of its own past, and carry it forward into the future.